on the live stream. Off. Oopsie. I'm sorry. That should be fixed now. I turned it off on Friday because I was doing something else. Oh dear. I'm sorry. Well, you got to see my doodles. That's something. I'll try to fix that later. Okay. Oh, right. If you want to be a billionaire, it pays to have rich parents. And actually, this isn't entirely true because some of our current crop of billionaires really just had middle-class parents, but middle-class parents that invested in their children in really concerted ways. Okay, so what are some of the economic advantages? Well, obviously, educated parents, right, themselves, they have higher wages. Oh, wow, my handwriting is really bad today. Higher wages, right, which means they can afford more post-secondary. So it's a lot easier for them to pay for university, right, or to put aside part of their income, while their children are young, as, things like, your college fund, your RESPs, or whatever you happen to call it, right? Those higher wages allow much easier payment for these sorts of things. Okay. Now, the government in the past, right, created systems that basically tried to balance this out. So if you look at it, the student loan system that exists today was created in the aftermath of the Second World War, when, in the US and in Canada and in other places in the world, there was the idea that we needed to shift more people from, say, manufacturing into kind of higher skilled jobs. There's a big impetus on this after 1957, especially. 1957, you see the launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik, which causes people to really freak out in Canada, the US, and Western Europe, and be like, oh, we really need to move more people into engineering, science, the STEM fields, so that we could, catch up to the Soviets. And so in part, they create systems to allow more people to attend university in the US, college, right? And one of these is the student loan system, where basically you would be able to borrow money typically from either the government or from a bank that's been given guarantees by the government that, you will repay that loan. And some of it is kind of nasty, because in a lot of ways, well, maybe you're a good investment as engineers, but let's say someone majoring in theater design or English or maybe even sociology is less of a good bet in terms of income. But basically the way, the US has done it is that your student loan is non-dischargeable. So you can't, even if you declare bankruptcy, your student loan stays with you forever in the US, right? And if you die, right, then your descendants or whoever survives you still has to pay back your student loan. It's nasty. In Canada, it's a little better. Your loan is non-dischargeable for 7 years. So if you have a student loan, you have to pay it for at least 7 years. Even if you declare bankruptcy in year 1, you still have to pay for 6 more years on your student loan. And this is basically so that the bank that lent you the money has some sense that they're going to get at least part of that money back, or in the US, all of that money back. But this system was created so that people could get money to attend university and college, right? With the idea that, okay, if you're from a poor family that can't afford to send you to college or university, you're still going to be able to get a loan that's going to allow you to do that, right? Now, this, to some extent, has become problematic, especially for millennials and Gen Z, right? Tuition fees have tripled in the last 2 decades, and it actually is worse than that in the US. Like, that's Canada. Roughly in the last 20 years, tuition has doubled or tripled, depending on where you are. In the US, it's gone up even more than that, well beyond the rate of inflation, partially because it seems like colleges and universities are overcharging for a lot of things, essentially knowing that a lot is going to be filled in with, federal, provincial grants. And student loan debt has increased considerably. The average Canadian that has student loan debt coming out, it's about 25 to 30,000. Okay, right? So that's not too bad. In the US, it's often somewhere between 100K and as much as 200,000 in terms of student debt. So, a small mortgage payment in terms of student debt. And so that's, Canada, and that's the US. Okay, and that puts a lot more stress on low-income families, right? Having to figure out how, you're going to get these kinds of loans and how you're going to pay them back once you get out of, university or college. Okay, forward. Okay. So, beyond just our post-secondary, right? If we want to talk about other spaces where you see advantage in richer people, one of the things that's been kind of noted by a lot of kind of social researchers looking at where some of the advantages come from is they'll suggest that, people from kind of the poorer socioeconomic strata, right, working class and poor, are more likely to send their children. My coffee almost died, but I saved it, and that's the best thing about today so far. Children from the poorest kind of strata often go to school hungry or face sort of, questions about nutrition or nutritional quality, right? So one of the things that's been noted is that, when you talk about people from the poor kind of tier of the socioeconomic strata, they're much more likely to consume processed foods, right? Versus, fresh produce and meats. So, even when they are, and I mean, my wife has worked in kind of low-income schools in both Edmonton and Calgary and definitely seen this, that when you get into the people who are truly kind of poor or working class, you see a lot more junk food, right? Why? Because that super processed food is cheap. And I mean, it's also shelf stable, so it lasts a long time. Think here of your ramen noodles, right? Your ramen noodle cup, or your what is it, the fluorescent macaroni, Kraft Dinner, right? The one that turns fluorescent orange when you add milk and water to it. I don't think that color is entirely natural, and I don't know where from the cow does the orange come from. I'll never quite figure that out, but that's neither here nor there. Right? This stuff is cheap. It's shelf stable. What is a box of Kraft Dinner? Still like 99 cents or something like that. Maybe that's the dollar store one. I don't know. But in terms of kind of a comparison, it's nutritionally quite poor, right? I don't know if it's still an urban legend. I remember when I was in my undergrad and doing like the orientations, they're like, don't just eat ramen noodles. We've had students get scurvy. And I'm like, oh, that doesn't sound real. But, I suppose just eating Kraft Dinner, there's no vitamin C, you might very well get scurvy. Now, this on the whole, right, for things like brain development, for proper functioning of brain, for energy levels, you need good nutrition. So what we see in kind of poor and working class is much more often, they have poor nutrition, more things from the middle of the grocery store rather than from the outside edges. And I mean, if you ever look at the plan of a grocery store, the really nutritionally dense stuff is on the outside edges, and all those middle aisles are garbage. Tasty garbage, but garbage nonetheless. So, other things, right? Parents often have to work long hours, right? Which has a couple of things, right? In terms of nutrition, less likely their parents are preparing them high quality meals. But just in general, if their parents are working long hours and often in the care of people like older siblings, cousins, they're less likely to get extra help, right? Let's say like they're struggling on their homework, they're struggling to learn how to read or do math or whatever it happens to be. If their parents are working 2 jobs, especially, right, this is like single parents working 2 jobs to support their kids, less likely that they're going to have that extra support, much less likely they're going to get, extracurricular activities and all that stuff. As a result, they're less likely to be flagged as gifted or put in gifted programs. and much more likely to be put into, especially once you get into high school, right? The remedial classes, right? The classes that are typically, though we're too polite to say it in Canada, right? Those that were kind of tracking into working class professions. Germany is really like very structured about this. I think at like age 8, you take an exam and they're like, they track you there either into like the work, like the practical occupations or the university tier occupations. And so, if you don't do well as an 8-year-old, you're forever marred and sent into like one particular track of the schooling system. Germany's a really weird place. We're a little bit more polite about it in Canada, right? But you certainly know that there are people in the like in high school that are in that lower tier of math, lower tier of English, right? I can't remember what they are now. There's like the 30-1 and the 30-2. I think is that still what it is? Okay, I get to find out next year because my daughter goes to high school. She is not going to 30-2. I will not permit it. I will hire tutors and possibly slave drivers to make her succeed. I wonder how much a slave driver costs. I'm sure I can afford it. It'll be good. Like, do math. Do math better. Okay. So when you get tracked into those remedial tiers, right, it's often tracking you towards either no post-secondary or, technical schools or something like that. Okay. I say okay too much. I'm really sorry. Is that my key is sticky? All right. So we talked a little bit about Bourdieu earlier in the course, and I'll mention him again. So one of the things we can talk about with this Pierre Bourdieu, he's a French theorist. He's dead now. One of the things he talked about when we talk about education, especially, and how, coming from the middle class and upper classes tends to lead to you having certain advantages in education. What Pierre Bourdieu says is that everybody has what we would call cultural capital, right? Basically, your ability to use the way you speak, you present yourself, and the way you interact with the world to get ahead in life, right? And what he says is that schools tend to reward and encourage kind of languages, beliefs, behaviors, and competencies of the most powerful groups in society. And here, the most powerful groups are the middle class and upper classes, right? So middle and upper class kids tend to do the best in the school system. So for very specific reasons, right? One of them is, over that away, about an 8-minute walk, there's the education building, right, where we're training the next generation of teachers. Most of the teachers in our society themselves come from the kind of middle and upper classes, right? They themselves, they're in university to learn this vocation because they've been told that it's valuable to do so. So they come from the middle and upper class. And so when you have kind of middle and upper class students, they've been raised by parents that share the same values as their teachers, right? So when we have things like, politeness, right? The way that you navigate, how you talk to people, right? How you interact with adults, all of that, is structured by the families you come out of. And if you're coming from middle and upper class families, you're more likely to have values that align in terms of how important you think education is, how you interact with adults, right? Language that you use, politeness, and all of that stuff. So, they come from the same social class, they talk like their teachers, and poor kids and those from the working class often reflect the values and tastes of the communities they come out of as well. And this might be at odds with the school system, right? So you see this often, in claims made about, Black students in the US, right? And sometimes you call it like the hidden curriculum, that basically the school system is set up for white students, right? From the middle class. And when you get people who are Black, Latino, Indigenous, I think I spelled that wrong, but I don't care. They come from different kinds of communities with different sets of values, norms, understandings, sometimes different language, different ways of speaking, which sometimes brings them into conflict with a school system that sort of values white middle class, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant middle class kind of values and ways of being in the world, which can put them kind of at odds and at a disadvantage compared to those that fit in a little bit better. Okay. Okay. I just want to see if there were questions because I realized I haven't had a question slide in a while. Do you know if the predisposition to choose STEM fields for men or healthcare for women is the result of psychological or learned differences? Oh, this is a loaded question, which I will answer. Okay. It's a really good question, but one that's a little bit complicated to answer because there's more arguments here than there are necessarily sort of facts on the ground. But I will attempt to answer it anyway, because essentially the question is like, is it just that men are more interested in STEM-based fields than women, and women are more interested in sort of compassionate fields? And to some extent, like the feminist argument on this has been that a lot of this comes down to socialization, right? The feminists will say women from an early age, in the way that they're played with, in the kind of toys that they're given, right? And the kind of values that they're taught are socialized from like birth, essentially, towards, more what you would call compassionate or pink collar fields, right? So that when you give a little girl a doll to play with and you teach her that, the kind of normal girl way of playing with things is to, I don't know, put the baby to bed or burp the baby, right? All of these sorts of things, rather than playing with trucks or Lego blocks or whatever it happens to be, that you're kind of socializing them so that later when they're considering careers, they're going to go with what they think is the norm for women, right? And this has been the feminist argument. And a lot of the kind of policies that we've seen around getting more women into STEM fields has been around this idea of sort of changing the way we socialize people, right? Changing the way we socialize girls so that we get them interested in STEM at a much earlier age. Now, there's been some success there, right? Certainly, there's still a disparity between men and women in, I have it in another class. I should pull up the chart. But men and women in terms of math-based STEM fields, men still outnumber women by a large margin. That margin has closed over time, but it's still substantial. Now, the kind of counter argument to this is that there does seem to be sort of sex-based preferences and kind of broad patterns of sex-based interest. And a lot of the evidence here comes out of places like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland, all of which are extremely egalitarian. Like if you looked at like male-female egalitarianism, social attitudes, styles of education, they're incredibly egalitarian, right? They treat men and women essentially the same. And what actually happened was, as they've gotten more egalitarian, the number of women going into STEM fields has actually declined slightly, right? So more women have gone into your, teaching, nursing, social work kind of fields and actually moved slightly away from STEM. And if you look at some of the reports, out of the Swedish Ministry of Education, I think I looked at one from 2021, and they were treating this as a great crisis because they were actually seeing the number of women going into STEM fields going down. A lot of people will suggest, right, especially if you look at like social psychology, that there seems to be some kind of relatively ingrained social and maybe biological preference for women to go into more compassionate fields. Because, I'll put it this way, for a lot of the STEM fields, especially the more math-based they are, it seems like you can get women interested in going into them, but you seem to top out somewhere between 20 and 25% of the cohort. I know in Alberta, it kind of, they had all sorts of programs like Wisest that were aimed at getting women interested in the STEM fields, and they had some success, but sometime in the kind of late 1990s, early 2000s, the number of women as a proportion of the cohorts entering kind of flatlined, and it stayed roughly where it has been for about 20 years. So there may be some kind of, it might be socialization, it might be deeply ingrained. I could talk to you about rhesus monkeys and how boy rhesus monkeys like trucks and girl rhesus monkeys like dolls, and how maybe that's just built into the primate brain. But again, that's maybe a story for a different class altogether. I think there's probably some of both, right? Some socialization and probably some kind of, genetic biological component. But I'm not a social psychologist, so that literature I only know a little bit about, which is why I spent 5 minutes talking to you about it. Okay, so that's a good question, though. So the answer to your question is, I can tell you both sides, but I will take no position on it. All right, so back to Bourdieu. Right, so Bourdieu will suggest that schools, in terms of how they affect the labor market and how you move through life, they're not neutral institutions, right? They reflect the overall power structures, and especially the disproportionate influence of the middle class in politics, right? The middle class, in most Western societies is the largest social class, and it's certainly the most powerful one for a couple of reasons. One of them is, compared to their poorer, confreres, they vote. So the middle class votes, the middle class donates money to political parties, and so the middle class is very, very powerful. So, we're about to go into election season in Canada, right? So I almost guarantee you're going to hear Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre. I'm assuming Mark Carney's going to win the Liberal race at this point. The coronation will be completed in a few days, I'm sure. You're going to hear them talk a lot about the middle class, right? And you're going to want to hit your head against the wall because it's going to be the middle class. We're going to give middle class tax cuts. We're going to support middle class Canadians. We're going to grow the middle class. Middle class, 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 because they vote, right? Working class and poor Canadians vote far less. And the upper class is too small to really make a difference, right? The top 10%, is not enough to shift elections. So you really have to appeal to the middle class. So a lot of what we do politically is aimed at the middle class. And honestly, once we go into the election, and I'm not sure, it's either going to be right away or in the fall, but just pay attention to how many times you hear the words middle class. Okay, so yeah, due to relative wealth and political engagement, their ideas have the most currency. And thus, right, the schools tend to reproduce the social class structure and really favor the middle class. And yeah, working class children, lots of studies on this, actually see their learning goals go down as they go through school. The longer they're in school, the less they like it, right? And then, if we're talking college admissions, especially in the US, right, selection committees often see extracurriculars like interns or studies abroad or, music lessons, whatever it happens to be, as proof of engagement in students and a reason you might admit them. But the working class and lower classes often just can't afford these luxuries, so they're dispossessed in more ways than we often appreciate. Okay, so status attainment research. So this is a critique of human capital theory as well. Basically, when we talk about status attainment research, we talk, I guess I kind of spoiled this because we talked about it a second ago in that question. When we talk about what people actually want to do, right? What statuses they want to achieve, status attainment research tends to look at, differences in values and how they affect what people actually want. So, one of the things that we know, Canadian women still less likely than men to translate academic credentials in jobs with higher pay and more career potential. Now, there's a lot of arguments, again, kind of back and forth as to why this is. It might be, and again, it's always funny to put this to engineers, and there's more women in engineering than there ever has been, but it might be because of the academic training that women seek. And we talked about this, I think, before. These kinds of professions, teaching, nursing, social work, and other kind of female-dominated industries tend to be non-scalable. Meaning, there are hard limits on how big you can make them and how much money you can make out of them, right? Right, you can only teach so many students, right? If you have more than 30 first graders in a classroom, everything breaks down, nobody learns anything, right? If you're going to provide good care, you can only provide good care to so many patients, right? And this sort of puts a hard cap in a lot of cases on how much you can make, even with, say, or like if you're going to be a social worker, how many clients you can have, right, while you're still serving them well. This puts a hard cap on earnings because you just can't squeeze more people into this, and a lot of times you're then reliant on the state, because schools and hospitals are paying your wages. You're reliant on the state and how much they're willing to pay you. So in choosing these kinds of careers, right, women often choose non-scalable careers where, and again, I should bring in the chart. Maybe I'll do it next time. In terms of like STEM fields are far more scalable, right? You can manufacture more things, right? If you come up with, some great product, you can make more of them, right? You can increase the number of iPads you sell, or whatever widget you happen to come up with, whatever great invention you happen to come up with, you can make more of them, right? If there's more demand, you can fill that demand. You can sell more stuff. You can build new factories, increase your distribution network, right? All of those things. You can increase the number of transactions or the type of financial instruments you use, all sorts of things like that. So men, in choosing things like engineering, science, and often finance, these are scalable fields, right? You can increase the scale, which increases the dollars. Okay, so I'm answering why these have lower status and lower pay. Yeah, in terms of status, women's, things like teaching, nursing, and social work do tend to have lower status as well than fields like the STEM fields. And I think it probably goes down specifically to, we live in a capitalist society, so the things that are most kind of valued by a capitalist society is money, right? Is how much capital it can generate. And while these are all, actually critical to social function, they're seen as kind of like basic and they don't generate kind of the flashy things like innovations or, satellites that broadcast the internet to your phone, or whatever, rockets that can land themselves on a launch pad. So they don't make as much money, and so they tend to have lower status in a capitalist society. And lots of people, especially conflict theorists, Marxists, have suggested that this is a problem, that we should actually value teaching more than we do, maybe engineering, but that's just not how it works. The one that always gets me is the arguments about hockey players, right? Why should we value, hitting round rubber thing on ice more than we value teachers? And I have no answer for that, but we do for whatever reason, right? We're more than happy for Connor McDavid to get paid $14 million a year, whatever he gets paid, while a teacher gets paid, $75,000 a year. So there you go. Okay, I answered this question. It was a good one. Okay, so other things that tend to kind of distort the labor market, right? In ways that potentially mean that we don't have a transparent, right? That's human capital theory is predicated on the idea of a transparent labor market. The fact that we don't always value, immigrant experience in the same way as we do those of people here. I got 2 minutes. I don't know. 2 minutes. How much can I talk about this in 2 minutes? I'll talk about it a little bit. I'll say newcomers in Canada, right, often struggle in the labor market. One of the big problems that they face is licensing requirements, so that even those who have skills that we need in the Canadian economy often struggle to get those skills recognized. And right, this is true of engineers and doctors. And I can tell you some stories next time about a few that I knew. Some friends of mine who came over from different parts of the world and struggled in the labor market specifically because they were coming from other places. So if you talk about immigrants in general, they will experience less upward mobility in their careers than people who were born here. But why don't I, because I hear zippers going, why don't I leave it there? We'll pick it up on Wednesday. I think we'll see. I don't know if we'll finish, but we'll do our best to finish up talking about labor markets. I think we can probably finish up talking about labor markets and move on to something else one more unit before the next midterm. So have a great rest of your day. We'll see you on Wednesday.